more of a, and it's going to be a higher level compared to other talks. So it's going to be talking about the methodology. I won't have any code examples, and this applies beyond Python. It applies to just software development in general. Well, to get started, we have to know what happened before Agile. And we had this thing called waterfall. And waterfall, the best way to think of it is applying other engineering disciplines like building a car and trying to apply them to software development. So we say, hey, we're going to build this car. We know it has 4 wheels. We want it to be red. We know it's going to weigh this much. Let's get all the materials. Let's build it. Let's test it. And then let's send it out, to the world, send it to car dealerships. And then when people need to come to us for maintenance, we'll perform maintenance. But this whole phase took a few years, right? Which in software is light years. We would spend, like 2 or 3 years, maybe even a year just gathering requirements. And that's how software was done in the 1980s and 1990s, early to mid 2000s. This was the standard, but there was a lot of problems with this. Probably the biggest was requirements change, technology changes, and the end users, the customers, the stakeholders, they have different expectations, and usually you don't get it until the car gets there. You don't show them a half-finished car. You show them. So if somebody was trying to make the next SaaS platform, this would be like, we're not going to give it to our customers until we release every single feature and we call it done. We're trying to, you would spend 2 or 3 years developing it. 5 years wasn't uncommon. And then the customer would see it. And if it was an internal tool, a lot changes in 5 years. Imagine trying to build your website in 2005, and it's not going to be released to 2012. Like, the technology, there's security concerns. It's like going from jQuery to using full stack React. Like, there's just a bunch of changes that change. And another problem, and this is from the International Business Analysts Institute, is it found that most IT projects or software development projects were over budget and took longer than expected. It was close to 80% for both. So 80% of budgets involving developing software were over budget, so they were spending more than they thought, and they were also, they took longer. And usually they would give it to their stakeholders at the end. You would give them your car, and then they would be like, well, I wish the car was green, and you gave me a red car, and you only made red cars, and we don't have any options. Where if you had showed them the car, where you're putting on the wheels, while you're building and engineering the product, they would have changing requirements, changing feedback, and maybe they see it and you're like, oh, they can be talked into a green or a red car. And so what comes from this is Agile. And so Agile is breaking this it's essentially waterfall, but in many phases, called sprints. Sprints are usually 2 to 3 weeks. Sometimes they're 1 week. Usually don't see more than 3 weeks, but it depends by company. And you gather requirements, you build, you test, and you build just a bit of functionality. You deliver it to your customer, and then you do it again. And you have a way of measuring your velocity, your metrics for this small iteration. So you're able to, this would be like, for the car analogy, this is like you build the frame, you show it to the customer, you say, okay, I do want, SUV, this is good. And you can change if something changes with the requirements, you can respond to it quicker, as opposed to keep building and building and then have something the customer doesn't want. So next, there's several different types of Agile. Most people use a hybrid of different types of Agile. Most popular you've probably heard of is Scrum. There's also XP, or extreme programming, and something I've noticed that's been gaining popularity is Scale. Scale is used for large enterprises. Usually Agile is 1 or 2 teams. Scale is when you have, 50 or 60 members and they're working together, or a whole company, an enterprise Fortune 500 company, and they're all in a massive Agile organization. So there's some key terminology. A sprint is what you're doing is a time period, 1 to 2 weeks, and you're measuring velocity, you're measuring how many points and story points are you being used. You're measuring workload. And there's various places you can measure story points, which brings me to story. A story is a task, it's a feature. Stories can be broken into tasks, which are smaller workloads, and stories make up epics. You make an epic if a story or a feature is going to take more than a single sprint. So if it takes 2 to 3 sprints or more than a sprint, then they're part of an epic, and it's just something that's going to take a long time. There's a backlog where you're adding requirements, and there's usually a product manager or a business analyst or somebody gathering requirements who prioritizes the backlog. And then this last term, which is unique to Scrum, is Scrum of Scrums. And so in Scrum, you have somebody called Scrum Master, very Scrum, lots of, and the Scrum Master will meet with other Scrum Masters throughout the sprint or throughout different sprints, and they'll try to touch base with where they're on with their deliverables for their team, and basically touch base with other teams to find out different timelines. So there's a few ceremonies in Agile. There's a backlog grooming. So usually the different team members will meet with a product owner, and they'll look at all the different stories. They'll fill in story descriptions. They'll point stories. They'll say how long the story is going to take. They're trying to make sure the story is ready to go. There's also a retrospective at the end of the sprint where it's supposed to be very inclusive, and it's basically saying, what did we do right? What could be done better? And where are we going to plan for next sprint to make sure it's even a better sprint? So it's iterative feedback within Bo and team, less about the end product, but more about team dynamics. There's sprint planning where you're planning for the next sprint. This is like backlog grooming. Depending on the Agile methodology, it could be combined. And then there's stand-ups. Stand-ups typically once a day, typically in the morning. But if you work with a team that's international, it can be various times. I've seen teams where it had to have stand-up in the morning and stand-up in the evening, stand-up in the afternoon, depending on where the other teams are at, if you're working internationally. But the biggest benefit of Agile is that you're able to get with changing requirements, and you're able to keep up with different technology innovations. Imagine building a machine learning application in 2010 and say, I want to do natural language processing. And you can only use libraries that requirements team found in 2010 and nothing from 2022, and you spent 20 years. It would probably be pretty terrible compared to all the tools that are available now. And you get immediate feedback with your stakeholders. You're able to show a working product. If you have a beta or prototype, you're rapidly prototyping and you're getting feedback, and you can find out if your customers, your stakeholders actually want the product that you're building. I think that's, my computer froze. 1 second. I think that's it. Any questions? It's completely silent.
One question in the chat is Kanban a type of Agile, or is it its own thing?
That's a good question. I put Kanban on here once. I think it depends on the person you talk to. I don't know the exact, if it's considered Agile. So for people not familiar with Kanban, it's where instead of planning for story points and planning your stories. You're bring stories in, and it's all about work in process. So it's less about how many points you scheduled and your velocity. It's about how many stories you completed, and it's often used for people who are in non-functional requirement roles like DevOps, systems administrators, people who are doing work, but they aren't directly building the product. They're sort of building the supporting features, or they have, other priorities like being on call. And so using Kanban allows them to prioritize work, but they don't have to say, I'm going to get 100 points done this sprint. They can say, I'm going to bring in work when I have time. And if not, I'm going to be doing my own on-call stuff. But it's, there's a lot, I found quite a bit of debate whether or not it was considered agile or not. So it's probably, there's enough philosophies about agile and different interpretations. There's a lot of people who do Scrum with Kanban components. There's most likely a flavor of Kanban that is agile.
Do you ever get anyone pushing back against agile, not because it makes things more agile, but rather, ironically, there's so much software built around agile and management of agile processes that it actually becomes a extremely rigid system? Have you ever encountered that?
Yeah, I've encountered that. It's usually, I don't want to stereotype, but it's usually at larger organizations where they've been I've seen it at like larger companies where sometimes it doesn't make sense. Like it's just like there are benefits of being in waterfall in places, and I don't agree with personally with following the philosophies or the frameworks word for word and following every single ceremony. I think that people should be a little bit flexible. They should do the things that they feel best about. Like if you say we're not going to have agile or a sprint ceremony every sprint, we're going to have every other sprint. The companies need to do what works best for them. And I don't like, but I've also been at places where they follow the scale handbook word for word, and they say, okay, this is the fourth day, we have to estimate our story points, and they're using it like a holy scripture. With these frameworks, they change every couple of years. And so the short answer is I've definitely encountered it. I recommend people use agile and they use the methodology, but they use some level of skepticism and they do what they think works best for their organization.
Awesome. Thank you for bringing up the word skepticism. Yeah, at my company, where we give individual teams the luxury of choosing how they work, and typically we follow more of an open source methodology, which is we don't estimate story points. You just pick up tickets or you work with your stakeholders directly, and there's like we deliberately try to not have any process, including agile. And maybe it's just our environment and our working style, but the slowest teams across the planet at Octopus are the ones who follow agile. So and they have backlog grooming sessions and they ask for like extra software pieces, and invariably they're the slower ones. But I mean, they're the ones who get really formal with agile. I'm not saying that we don't use agile processes. We're just, we have this eye of skepticism, and we rapidly discard anything that feels like it's impeding process or reducing developer time.
My experience was with companies that were very structured. They spent a lot more time discussing story points over actually doing the work. Like there was, like 2 hours debating if a story is a 5 or an 8-point story, where if you spent 2 hours, you could have been halfway done with the story. So I don't agree with being completely inflexible with requirements, but compared to waterfall and planning everything out years in advance, I think if you're just in a basic sprint structure and you're trying to go either Scrum or Kanban or some combination of the two, I think you're probably in a good place.
We had one last question from the chat, and I'm actually going to cut it off there just for time. The question was from Glenn, and Glenn asked, what are the most commonly used tools for Agile?
So there's technically, you don't need any tools, but having some sort of project management software. But most popular software suite is probably the Atlassian suite with Jira, Bitbucket, and using Jira. But I'm currently using ClickUp in my current company, and that's been great too. There's a bunch of different project manager software suites. Like I get ads for Monday.com all the time, and I've heard good things about that. If you want to be very cheap, you can just use Google Sheets and just plan out your story points in Excel and make sticky notes. If you're in person, I mean, if you're actually going to use software and you want to be more efficient and you have resources, you really can't go wrong with any of these project manager tools. But the most popular one that I've heard of is probably the Atlassian suite with Jira.